So why don't you talk for a minute about how you got to Williams? What were you doing before you got, what led you there?
Um, I went to Williams not too long after graduating from college. While I was a senior at MIT, I used to play a lot of pinball. And I was interviewing at a lot of the respectable companies, IBM, DEC, Bell Labs. And one night I was criticizing some of the things in the pinball machine. Um, this was about 1978, fall of 78. Solid state pinballs had been out just for a year or two. We played a lot of a game. The game in the basement of my dorm was called 8-Ball. And there were a couple of glaring bugs in the software that really, were annoying. I was whining about it one night at the dorm, and somebody said to me, "Could you do any better?" And the next day I wrote letters to Gottlieb, Bally, and Williams to say, "Hey, I'm, a senior going on next year, and I have a strong interest in pinball, and they're going solid state, and I think there's a lot I could do, and maybe we should get together. I'm going to be in Chicago, which is where I grew up, over Christmas, so there's no even exposure to you. How about if I come in while I visit?" I got no response from Gottlieb or Bally, but I got a call or a letter from Dave Poole at Williams, who was director of engineering at the time. And I went in to interview, and I just loved everything about working in a pinball company. And they said, "This is great. We are starting to do our very first video game. We are just putting the team together. We need people to come and talk to us." And they made me an offer, and so I went there to go make pinball machines and video games.
How did you feel about getting switched over to video as opposed to pinball?
I was excited about that. I mean, I was a big fan of both pinball and video. Video was really in its infancy. At that time, this is now about January of 80, and Space Invaders had been a big hit, and I think Asteroids had just come out. And those were just huge. When I was, again, a senior in college, there was one Space Invaders in a bowling alley in the Student Union building, and I used to go down into the bowling alley to play that game pretty regularly. It was just, it was the precursor of the whole video game boom, and it was just such an exciting, addictive game that I really got excited about. Let's try and do video games, and it was really the time to be doing them. Pac-Man had not been invented yet. That came out, a couple of years later, just to sort of put the time frame on it. And I did end up going right into pinball at Williams. So I worked for about a year on pinball, and at the same time helped Eugene get the stuff going with Defender, which was Williams' first video game. And it was a terrific thing and a terrific time.
When you say you got stuff going with Eugene, what does that mean? What were you doing?
Eugene Jarvis was put in. He was a pinball guy. He had done some pinball with Steve Ritchie out at Atari, and both Steve and Eugene came to Williams, and they did Firepower, which was a monster game for Williams, absolute mega hit, and they had just finished that up when I started at the company. And Eugene was given the job of leading the first video game project. Williams was a pinball company, and video was starting to really become a major force, and Williams decided they should get into it, and they put Eugene in charge of that. And I was working on pinball stuff primarily, but also as a pinball project, it's not consistent in time. You get crunched for a while, and then maybe they have to make a new Whitewood, and there's time where there's not a lot to do. That changed later on, but back in 1980, in between Whitewoods, we kind of got relief. And I'm working with Steve Ritchie. He tends to really be methodical and meticulous, and so there was a lot of time in between iterations of his stuff. So in between that time, I was actually going to work in a different building in Chicago. They had a little facility on Belden Avenue, which was sort of the video game skunk works. And it's a great reference because there are 2 times in my life where there were projects with an amazing synergy and excitement and just and both trying to do the impossible. And the first one was the Defender project, and the second one was the Pinball 2000 project. So I was going back and forth I was working on Black Knight in pinball and a new operating system for the pinball at the time, and going back to Belden Avenue to work with Eugene and his team to work on Defender when I could.
I'm sort of interested in this documentary and sort of the evolution of pinball from about 1980 till the time of Pinball 2000. You mentioned wide body pinball.
Right.
That was sort of a, what do you call it, a fad for a little while. Describe what wide body pinball is and why it was interesting.
Wide body pinball is this thing that came and went over the 20-year period that you're talking about, 1980 to 2000. I think it was first created by Atari. Atari had this really, really doomed pinball effort where they came up with an electronic pinball system, and they created their games on this very, very wide frame. I think Airborne Avengers might have been the first game that they did that, and this was right at the advent of solid state pinball. All the tried and true companies had switched over, and they came out with this wider pinball, and it helped them in the area of pricing, because it's always been an uphill battle to get the price up on pinball, and one of the problems with pinball is that the price never came close to inflation, while all the ingredients, all the components that went into it kept on rising. The cost per play, actually, I would say over the 20-year period you're looking at, continually went down in real terms and actually in time per absolute money. After Atari did that, everybody else followed and came with a wide body as an alternate model. Bally made a few, Williams made a few, Gottlieb made a few. Stern followed with a wide body, and then they quickly followed with a medium-sized wide body. They had games, I think, like Cheetah and Flight 2000 that were in a size that is pretty similar to what ended up being done by Williams in Twilight Zone and Star Trek Next Generation, Indiana Jones, that era. Part of it is, I think that some of the designers like to have more real estate to put more things. Part of it is what Pinball 2000 was about, an attempt to change the product to generate demand. If you've got a product that's mature or more saturated, you then say, what can we do? What can we change? We're still back in 1981, and video is king and taking over, and Defender now is a big hit. It was a runaway smash hit for Williams. And so pinball was declining, and those of us in the design area, we all wanted to be video game designers. Williams put together a new engineering building on Kedzie Avenue in Chicago. And they figured, if 2 guys in a closet on Belden actually 3 or 4 guys on a closet on Belden can create one game, if we hire 50 of them, we'll get a whole lot of games. And that's what their spreadsheet said on the bottom corner. So they started hiring, can you design video games? Well, whatever. Well, do you know about video games? Well, do you know what a video game is? Yeah, okay, you're hired. And it became a really, really unpleasant place to work. It was, they put us in rows of little tiny offices. The heating and air conditioning never worked right in the building. And it just wasn't a great place for us to do the kind of thing that was probably the most wonderful creative environment, which we had on Belden Avenue, which was one little team trying to do the impossible. Eugene and I had talked about going off and trying to do this on our own, and the company was obliging by not really taking good care of the designers, at least to the extent that the designers were responsible for generating tens of millions of dollars of revenue and profit, we didn't think that they were acknowledging that on the compensation end. And in February of 1980, Eugene and I left Williams and started our own video game group. Our video game group was called Vid Kids, and we did 3 games. The first game we did was Stargate, which was a sequel to Defender. And that was done because when we started, Williams needed a game in 4 months or something. And it's like, well, the only game you can have in 4 months would be if we did a sequel to Defender, and they liked that idea, and
it was a big hit.
It was a very big hit. We then did Robotron 2084, which is probably the most revered classic game right now. There's something about the playability of that game that has really survived, whereas most of the other games are interesting from a novelty point of view. But people really, the two-hand control, there was never anything like it before, and nobody ever used it after in a manner that had that kind of a play and feel.
So you guys sold these games to Williams?
Yeah, Williams, right after we left, Williams wanted us, okay, if you're going to do it, big boys, go start your company, but, stay with us. At that time, Mike Stroll was running Williams, and he understood that, notwithstanding the ego and whatever of us leaving, that we could, that we would probably come up with good product, and that, he'd like to be making that product. And they made Stargate and Robotron, and made quite a few of each of those. And our third and final game was one called Blaster, which was ahead of its time in the 3D side. There really was very little in the 3D arena in games. It was technically something that was hard or impossible on the given hardware. What had been out, Battlezone, which was on a vector system, and right about the same time as Blaster, Atari came out with Star Wars, which was again another 3D type of game. And we decided on a raster system that if we did this and that and the other thing, we could get a 3D-ish game. And it was a pretty neat technical marvel, not a very great game overall. And it came out right as video games, both home and coin-op, hit the skids, and that was about 1984. No, that was 1983. All right, anyway, we were talking about Blaster. They sold maybe a couple hundred units. It was not a success, partially on the quality of the game, and partially the business was really going downhill. And Eugene and I we were getting ready to start a next game, and neither of us really felt motivated to try and do another game into that marketplace. And Eugene ended up moving out to California. He went to get his master's at Stanford, and I started kicking around figuring out what should I do next.
Did Vid Kids work out the way you guys wanted compensation-wise?
Yes, we did. We did much better at Vid Kids than we would have done at Williams. Pat Lawler was doing the firmware in the pin setter. Probably a month into it, Pat finished up his part of the project and left. And Pat had said to me, I'm working on something weird in my basement. It's a pinball machine, and I want to show it to you sometime. And somewhere along the way, I went out to Pat's house, and he had mocked up something that was going to become Wrecking Ball, which was going to become Banzai Run. He had put a vertical, playable playfield behind a regular game. And he said, I think this will revolutionize pinball. And, are you interested in trying to work with me on this and see how it goes? Pat and I spent probably 6 or 8 months building Wrecking Ball in that studio. And he built a cabinet, designed and built a play field, 2 play fields, the horizontal and vertical one. We bought a brand new Road Kings pinball. That was Williams' latest game. We bought it in the box, and we stripped it for the harnesses. We took the electronics out, and then all the parts that we could use. And we literally brought Wrecking Ball up. We brought it to life using the Williams electronic system. We brought that to Williams, and they seemed sort of interested. And through a protracted period, we went back and forth, and we made a deal for us to come in and work on this game. And we worked on that game at Williams. It became Banzai Run. Right after that, they hired Pat to design games for him, and that just has become a legendary pinball career. And from that time of going in to work on Banzai Run, I went to work at Williams every day for the next 11 years. That was my last re-entry to the building. And there was a home for me in the pinball department for that entire period.
Cool.
The rest of it gets less interesting and complicated.
But you mentioned about Williams acquiring Bally in the late 80s?
Right.
Why did they do that?
In the late 80s, pinball hit a lull. And also in that period, Williams was king and Bally was probably not profitable. And so Bally Corporate decided, we're getting out of the business. And they probably looked for buyers and couldn't find any. And at this point, Neil Nicastro had just taken charge of Williams. And Neil I think Neil's a really good wheeler dealer. And I don't know what the details of the term were, but my guess is that, he was able to acquire the assets of Bally, both the video and pinball assets at a very attractive rate, which got even more attractive because as it played out, we were able to make machines to use up all the inventory. My guess is that all of the parts, came over for nothing as garbage. And we turned those parts into pinball machines with a profit margin. So instead of, paying $1,500 or $1,600 for all the parts in the game, they were probably paying $500 or $600 for this whole series of games made around the Bally parts.
Especially like on pinball, what determined whether a machine was a Williams machine or a Bally machine?
When Williams acquired Bally, originally the Bally designers were doing Bally games. Bally was really our uninteresting or discount brand at the time. And the biggest run of a Bally game, I think, was 3,000 games, which was done by Elvira, which was a great game done by Dennis Nordman. In 91, Neil wanted to get Bally off of the, weak sister level, and he asked Pat to do a Bally game. And Pat was going to work on Addams Family at the time. And I worked with Pat on that game. I remember Neil asked Pat to do this, and Pat really, didn't like the idea. He felt he'd be sacrificing sales of his game because people wouldn't, buy as many if it had the Bally label. Obviously, history tells a different story. It turned out to be the best-selling game not only Williams but anybody has ever done in a pinball machine. But I remember when we did the game, and we were resigned that we would do the best game we could, and it would sell, 4,000 or 5,000 units if we were successful, and would get Bally out of the rut. And the game just was one of those times where everything came together, including the public's perception. The game, the rules, the flow, the art, the mechanics, the gimmick, the appeal of the license. It's just one of those rare things when everything comes together and you have a monster, and it was really something to be able to be involved in that. And it was also, again, it was very early in the dot matrix era. It was Williams' third or fourth dot game, and I think that is another ingredient that helped propel it. I think we did a really good job with the dots on that game. And
you were the programmer on that game?
I was a programmer. along with Mike Boone. We, come the 1990s, it was pretty common to have 2 or more programmers on a game because the job got bigger and bigger. We skipped over in between Bonsai and Adams. I ended up rewriting the pinball software system for the second and last time in 1990, and that first went into Funhouse, which was my second game with Pat. Adams was the third, and then we did Twilight Zone. We did four in a row, although Pat had Whirlwind and Earthshaker in between Bonsai and Funhouse while I was working on the new OS. We had a pretty fixed team that in the end had John Yowsey doing the art on every game, Chris Granner doing the sound, John Crutch doing the mechanical engineering, and then Pat and I doing design and software.
That's great.
So it was a real nice run of games.
What was the last machine you guys did together?
Twilight Zone. Twilight Zone is a big favorite of the collectors, and it's one of the least favorite games that I worked on.
Really?
Part of it is I probably still can't get over the frustration of not balancing the game in a way that would work for everyone. We went, it would be too easy and too hard and too easy and too hard, and we just could not get, to my satisfaction, the balance right on that game. I think it ended up being too hard, which works fine for all the guys collecting games in their basements.
Right.
Commercially, they made a lot of them. It was not a bad investment, but it didn't perform like the other games we had worked on. And, I think we ended up making a few too many for the market. So that, to me, it was a major personal disappointment. But in all of the pinball circles that we move in, this is heralded as one of the great games of all time. And I just have never gotten over the frustration of that game.
What was your favorite game of that era? Addams Family or something else?
Favorite game that I worked on would be Addams Family or Funhouse.
Okay.
Favorite game I didn't work on is probably Attack from Mars.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good game.
That game was awesome.
Yeah. What was it?
Terminator 2 would be high on that list.
That's good too. For when you're writing the software for Addams Family, what were some of the debates you had on the team about how to make that machine work?
The biggest one that I remember on Addams Family was having to do with Thing. Because if you remember the configuration of the game, the ball shooter goes up a ramp and delivers the ball on a skill shot to Thing's hole. And the original rule that we put in was that when you did that, Thing would pick up the ball. And you were seeing Thing so much, and he became so non-special that it was a real problem. And that rule persisted all the way to our first test games. We brought the game to LA to the Addams Family movie opening. And all the way there and all the way back, Pat and I were debating what to do. I think we had just put the game on test and we brought it there, and we just didn't like it. And somewhere we needed to find a way to make him appear enough that people who weren't good would see him, but still to keep him special. And that I think was the biggest thing. I don't think I had any grasp of how powerful a toy Thing was to pick up a pinball and take it away. I had the little banks with the coins where the hand would come out and grab the coin as a kid. And so I think Thing never impressed me as being this really cool thing, but it was just something that people had to see. Everybody had to see it, and so it was very powerful, and we ended up getting it to a very good balance, in the end. But it was a long road, and often the different members of a design team, as you're going down that road, are not so patient with each other as these things are going on.